Hello and welcome to the very first car review, the first video, in fact, that I've ever done in Project Cars. Many of you have asked for it many times on the channel, and we are finally covering Project Cars. We're starting with the second game, of course, although I do plan to cover the first one as well, since there are some unique cars in that game which were not carried over. And what better place to start than with this? Of course, a hugely significant car to me because not only do you not see these vehicles in many games, but it is my favourite engine type of all time. The gas turbine powered Lotus Type 56 with that distinctive, gorgeous turbine whistle sound, an almost constant noise, unlike anything else on the track, unless there happens to be a Helmet TX on the track for no apparent reason. This car was of course significant for Lotus, significant for Indy, and significant in relation to another turbine car. And that is actually a connection that some people might not know about, because this car actually shares the same turbine engine, albeit retuned, as the STP Special Turbine Indycar from only 1 year before, the car that famously almost won Indy. This car didn't have success either, although 4 of them were built. Unfortunately, one of them killed its driver in testing. The other 3 did race, but not with success. But again, not necessarily winning a race is not the be-all and end-all of great experimental vehicles. After all, the iconic Chaparral fan car, the 2J, that never won a race either, but many of us still love it. So, being a turbine car, as it is, it means 2 things. 1, I'm automatically going to be interested in it. And 2, it presents, especially an inexperienced or otherwise unfamiliar driver, with an interesting challenge. Because, on the one hand, it's already a 1960s open-wheel Indy car. That in its own right is a potential challenge. But now you've got a turbine-powered Indy car. So not only is it already raw and old school, but it's also highly futuristic and super experimental, which in other words means they definitely didn't perfect the idea. So how do you even approach driving a turbine engine car? Well, the interesting thing is a turbine actually shares a lot in common with an electric car, of all things, despite the fact that they have totally opposite environmental impacts, this being one of the worst engines for the environment, and electric cars on their own right being one of the best, manufacturing not included. The engine itself works in a very similar way. Both have massive amounts of torque, both of them actually rev very high, although you don't typically think of an electric engine as revving at all, but they actually do. They do have an RPM, and they both have a very linear, clean, smooth, very relentless form of acceleration, which almost negates having a gearbox at all. And speaking of a gearbox, I would not recommend crashing in this car, because from what I could see, it doesn't seem to have a reverse gear. So if you slam it into a wall, you better hope you bounce off and end up the right way. Now, in terms of this engine's performance, it's an absolute beast. 500 horsepower, no conventional capacity, of course no pistons, no Doritos, it's not a rotary engine, but again, similarly to a rotary engine, it's hard to classify the engine size. They tend to call it some arbitrary number for racing, but there's no accurate way of really working out the size of a turbine in comparison to a normal piston engine car. Now, this car idles at a higher RPM than a modern Formula 1 car does at top speed. That is how fast this engine runs. The red line is well over 50,000 RPM. And the interesting thing within the game is, the specs actually don't sound that impressive. The power is good, 500, the weight is fantastic, barely over 1,300 pounds, which is 612 kilos, which in combination with the power means you're looking at a very impressive 817 horsepower per ton. But the interesting thing is, they rate it at 200 miles an hour, which is good, that's pretty good, but the acceleration, 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds. That sounds very slow. And that point alone brings me to the most important thing about approaching using a turbine engine vehicle. Because technically, yes, it does do 0 to 60 in 5.5 seconds. But here's the crucial thing. If you're unfamiliar with a gas turbine, the way in which you should imagine this engine, not in terms of how it works, but in terms of how to use it, is imagine instead of having a conventional engine with a turbo attached to it, imagine the entire engine is a turbo. Now you have lag with the turbo. Imagine the kind of lag that you would have with a turbo the size of an engine. A V8 engine sized turbocharger would produce massive amounts of lag, especially with 60s technology. That is how you should approach this engine. So in a similar way to how you would approach, for instance, a Group B rally car, where you put your foot down just before you need boost, you wait for those big turbos to spool up, and then you get that almighty shove, that is essentially how you need to approach a turbine as well. In fact, you can kind of hear that in some corners, the revs don't really drop. That whistle remains very high-pitched, and it doesn't slow down or go in the normal way that you'd expect it to when slowing down for a corner. That's one of the inherent issues with a turbine, because as much as I adore them, I'm the first to admit that, honestly, they're useless for racing. And the reason why they're useless, at least with this kind of technology in this time period, has surprisingly nothing to do with reliability, nothing to do with the lag, and nothing to do with the heat or fuel. And those tend to be the common issues. The reason why I think they're not very good for racing is simply because of their intended purpose. A turbine is not designed for start-stop driving. It's designed to be in a helicopter, which gets up in the air and stays there. You don't brake and turn and wait for stoplights and slow down for corners in a helicopter. You get up there, you stay up there, you come down when you're done. You can't do that in a race car. You're speeding up, slowing down, taking really low-end hairpins, square corners, long sweeping corners, slowing down for rivals, going in and out of pits. Turbines hate that kind of driving. They want to just get up to speed and stay there. And that is the genius thing about the Turbine Superbike, the MTT Y2K, my dream vehicle. It's a straight line machine, and that's why it works so well. It's not designed for corners, it's not designed for handling, it's essentially a street-legal land speed record bike. That is what a turbine lives for. They hate slowing down, and you can really feel it in this car. So then, with that in mind, how should you actually drive it? Well, in terms of braking, you want to start scrubbing off the performance a little bit earlier than, for instance, a modern car. And that's not so much due to a turbine, it's in part due to the fact that it's just a 1968 Indy car. In conjunction with that, though, one of the issues that a turbine has is that there's little to no engine braking. And that sounds radical to somebody who knows what I'm talking about. If you're, for instance, a younger viewer who doesn't know what I mean, in a conventional car, you've got a gearbox, and you can actually use the gears in addition to the brakes to slow down the car. Engine braking. In a turbine, you don't have that. It's more of just a disconnect that happens between the turbine and the wheels when you're not using it to power the car, in effect. And that's a very oversimplified way of saying it. But the results are the same. You back off the throttle, and the car doesn't really slow down. You really have to brake to slow the vehicle down. And then you encounter the problem that I mentioned. Now that you've dropped those RPM from 50 or 60,000 down to 30,000, well, of course, it's going to take time to get back up to that level again. So my top piece of advice for driving this car, which is incidentally all-wheel drive as well, which gives it fantastic handling, it's shockingly forgiving, in fact, and one of my favourite cars that I've driven in the game so far, is you actually need to really attack the throttle midway through a corner. And the problem with that is it goes against all of your intuitions as a driver. You would never do that in a normal car because you'd send yourself straight off the track or have instant wheel spin. In a turbine, it doesn't do that because it takes so long to spool up that you put your foot down midway through the corner, by the time you exit the corner, you've got better speed. Whereas if you drive this in a conventional way, you exit the corner, you put your foot down, and nothing happens because it takes a while to get going. So you really do have to have a totally different approach to driving a vehicle like this. As much as I love them, they're definitely not for everyone. Now, the interesting thing about that 0 to 60 time of a quoted 5.5 seconds is it's technically true. But if you, as I did at the start of this video, stop the car, hold the brake, and then redline it up to like 55,000 RPM and then let go of the brake, the 0 to 60 does not take 5.5 seconds, that's for sure. It takes more like 2 seconds, if that. But of course, redlining the car in a race isn't really an option. It is, however, one of the best ways to get phenomenal acceleration out of a turbine. Once again, it plays into the issue that I said. The turbine wants to be up around 50,000 RPM, so allowing it to do that and then releasing the brake gives you tremendous acceleration. Overall, as far as using this car in the game, of course it's a novelty. This car is to project cars what the Renault Espace F1 is in Gran Turismo, or the Turbine Superbike is in Project Gotham. It's this fascinating little piece of history, which for the enthusiasts such as myself, is such a cool thing to see. For a pure driver who's just looking to be the fastest though, well, you can definitely find some better options out there. However, either way, try out the car. If nothing else, it's a very different experience. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the Type 56 Turbine. Of course, stick around on the channel for more Project Cars 2 content, and until next time, I'll see you then. But for now, as always, thanks for watching.